Hey everyone, welcome to the channel. My name's Nader. In this video, we're going to go over a bunch of exercises together to get more practice with prototypes in JavaScript. In the previous video, we looked at the concepts for prototypes and prototypal inheritance, prototypical inheritance. In this video, we're just going to get more practice with those concepts. I have a few exercises lined up as well as a bonus to really tease our brain. So let's just get right to the exercises so we can get more practice together. Okay, so as with the other exercises, I have kind of a bunch of comments in each of these. These are in my GitHub repo, so feel free to download that. That's in the description below. What we're going to do is kind of read out each of these, and then I'm going to give you a chance to try it out yourself, and then we'll go through kind of one solution of this together, and we'll kind of do a walkthrough. So let's start with a warm-up to kind of get our hands warmed up here so that we can tackle these other ones in sequence. So for this one, what we want to do is we want to create a new function called boop. But we want to add this boop function to the prototype of string. Okay, this function should simply log out the string boop. Okay, so console log out boop. And the kind of way to do this, if this seems confusing already to you, definitely check out the prototype video because we saw how we can add things to things of prototypes, like for example, the object prototype or the array prototype. In this case, it just happens to be the string prototype. Okay, so just a fun little function here. It's just gonna boop us all day long. Then what we want to do is we want to create a new string with the value meow and assign it to a variable called cat. So just a regular variable that pointing to the string meow. Then we want to call the boop method on cat to make sure it works correctly. So obviously boop is not a method that exists on the string normally. There are other things that work on a string like length, for example, which we'll take a look at. So if you did this all correctly, you should be able to do for example, cat.boop, and it should log out this boop string. It's a very funny word to say. I've seen it in several different videos. I really like this one. For some reason, it sounds kind of cute. So give that a shot yourself, and then we'll go through a solution together. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to add a function to the prototype of string. Okay, so let's think about how this works. So we want to take the string dot prototype, right? And we want to, this is just a property on the string, I guess, like data type or class or object. And we want to add, as you can see, there's many things on the prototype already, but we want to add our own custom one, which is the boop function, right? And this is going to be just a function. And its sole job is to console.log out this wonderful string, and it's going to give us a boop. All right. So hopefully this works, but the question really is, how do we kind of call this string, this boop function, right? So let's try this real quick. I'm going to pull up my sidebar just as we go along, just so that we can kind of get more practice with this. I'm going to say string.prototype.boop. I want to see if this works, right? So I'm going to run node warm-up exercise. Okay, that seems to work, right? So we're calling the boop function on the prototype for string, but this isn't very useful, right? We normally wouldn't write code like this, right? This is not really the point of a prototype. So I'm just going to comment this out. We want to see if we can get this working with all strings that we create in JavaScript, right? So let's try this. So we want to say const cat is equal to the string meow, right? And then I want to see if I can do cat.boop, right? So I'm going to say cat.boop, but this is a function, so I have to call it, right? Now, this looks kind of weird, right? Because obviously cat or strings normally don't have this function on it, right? We just made this up. We just pulled that out of thin air and we added it to the string prototype. So let's try this out. I'm gonna run node warmup exercise, and there we go. Right? It actually logs out boop, which is fantastic. So what's happening here is the prototype of cat is the string prototype. So we can actually call this function because it's now available to every string in JavaScript. So we can confirm this really quick, and I'll just show you this because we're gonna do this a couple of times in this video. We can do Object.getOwnPropertyNames. And if I look at cat, let's take a look at what the property names for cat are. And if I run this, this is interesting, right? We'll see this in kind of a couple exercises. The property names are 0, 1, 2, 3, and length. That's interesting. I'd like you to think why that is. I'll let you kind of give that a ponder. But what's also interesting is if I grab the prototype of cat using the __ proto as one of the methods, or we can use Object.getPrototypeOf. I'll just clear my console here just so we can take a look at this. And you can see that there are a whole bunch of things on here. Unfortunately, it looks like boop is at the very, very bottom here. But if you, let me see if I think I can do this. There you go. So you can see boop is at the very, very bottom of this list, right? So you can see all of the string functions that we would normally have access to are on there for strings, as well as our boop at the very end, which we've added, right? So that's pretty awesome. Okay. Let's take a look at exercise 1. Now, for this one, what we want to do is we want to log out all the properties within the object prototype. So very similar to what we just did, right? We want to only log out the own properties for the object prototype. We want to do the same thing for the array prototype. And then we want to log out the properties for the arrays prototypes prototype. Okay. So just to really kind of emphasize what's happening here, the object has a prototype. We've seen that before. The array has a prototype. We want to look at all the properties that exist on each of those prototypes. However, sometimes we can go up the prototype chain if we haven't hit null yet in the prototype chain. So in this case, we want to see what is the array prototype's prototype itself, right? Is there something there, or is it also null? Okay, so give that a shot and try to explain why this might be. And we'll then go through it together. Okay, so to log out everything in the object prototype, this is what we're going to do. We're going to say console.log, and we're going to do Object.getOwnPropertyNames. So we want to take a look at the property names for what? Well, we want to take a look at the property names for the object's prototype, right? So we know that Object.prototype, the property Object.prototype points at the prototype for object in this case, which we saw is this kind of magical thing, right? It's this thing that we don't normally have access to, and we can kind of access it through the prototype, which points at this object, or __ proto on an instance of an object if we have one of those, which in this case we don't. We're just looking at it directly through the object. And the other way is using Object.getPrototypeOf. Okay, so let's actually just start with this and let's see what we get. So I'm going to do node exercise 1. And okay, so we get kind of this list of stuff, right? So that's pretty cool. So just to really kind of take this home, I want to actually pull up MDN so that we can actually see if this makes sense, right, as we're going along. So I'm going to pull up Google. I'm going to search for object in JS. And I'm going to go to my favorite documentation here, MDN. I'm going to pull that up and zoom in a little bit. And we can see here that we have object.prototype and then a whole bunch of stuff on it. If I kind of scroll through here, maybe it won't all fit on one screen, but we can see that everything that's object.prototype, right? Locale string to string, value of, property is enumerable, is property of, has own property, etc., etc. Everything object.prototype.that thing is showing right here, right? So we are in the correct place, and this is the actual prototype of object. Okay, so let's do the same thing, but for arrays. So we're going to say console.log, and we want to grab the Object.getOwnPropertyNames. And what do we want the property names of? Well, we want the property names of an array, right? The array's prototype. So we'll do array.prototype. Okay, so this again is pointing to the prototype for arrays in general. Okay, so if I run this, I'll actually console log or comment this one out. I keep saying console log, just so that it doesn't kind of cover my face. And we can take a look at the array prototype right here. So similar to object, we would expect all of these methods to exist for instances of arrays, right? So for example, I can do kind of like 1, 2, 3, and I can do dot length, right? I can do dot map, which we've seen before. We can do dot reduce, dot sum, dot filter, etc., right? So again, just to really hammer this home, I'm going to search for array in JS on Google. I'm going to pull up my favorite MDN. I'm going to scroll down here on the right hand or left hand side, and we can see that everything that's array.prototype.something, right? Length, concat, copy within, every entries, etc. Those are all going to be in here, and they are, right? Which is pretty awesome. So that is the array prototype. So that kind of makes sense. So now I'm just going to comment this one out. You want to log out all the properties within the array prototypes prototype. Okay, so let's think about this. The kind of way you probably would approach this would be something like this, right? We'll say console.log object.getOwnPropertyNames, sorry, of array. So we know array.prototype. That's what we just did, array.prototype. So we probably would want to say .prototype. Right? So let's see what happens if we do this. I'll kind of clear my console, I'll run this again, and we get an error. We say cannot convert undefined or null to an object. So this is actually saying that effectively what this is actually giving us, so if I log this out directly, this is going to be null, right? So if I, or undefined, sorry, in this case, right? So we're trying to get the property names of undefined, which is not, there is nothing on undefined. It's just a primitive type and there's nothing on it at all. So this is kind of confusing. So why are we getting undefined? Well, think about this, right? If I comment this back in and I log this out, we can see that prototype is not on here, right? So this is kind of interesting. So this is an object, right? So we can do array.prototype, and then we have .push and .unshift and all that kind of stuff, right? So if we come back here, we can see all of these different things listed as we saw with the object. Okay, so the way that we can actually grab the prototype of the prototype, there's really kind of two ways to do this. Okay, I'm going to show you kind of both ways. I'll show you the more intuitive way first, and then I'll show you kind of the slightly more confusing way. So I'll do console.log, and I'll comment out this one over here, and I'll do the same thing, Object.getOwnPropertyNames. I'm going to create an array. I'm not going to put anything in it for now, just to keep it really concise, but what this is this is an instance of an array, right? This is like an array object, right? We've created a new array, right? And we know that with objects and arrays, they have prototypes, right? But to access it, we don't do .prototype, right? Because if I do this on an instance of an array like this, we're going to get the same thing as before, because this arrays don't have a prototype property on them. They have a proto property on them. Okay. So if I do this, what we'll see is exactly what we saw on the array prototype, because this and this are pointing to the exact same prototype, right? This is literally pointing to the prototype, but for arrays. And this is pointing to the prototype for arrays. So they both point to this prototype object. So we can actually go one up further. So if I say .proto again here, what we'll actually see is that now we are at the object prototype. Okay. If you recall, this is the exact same thing that we got up over here. So what we're asking in this statement is grab the prototype of this array, then grab its prototype as well. So then the question is, okay, well, how do we get this one, right? How do we get it through this array.prototype method? So this is a bit awkward. I'll show you that we can do this __proto here for the prototype, and then I'll run this and we'll see that we actually get the object prototype over here. Now, the reason for this is because the prototype is kind of a pointer to this object, and then the object technically can point back to the prototype. And there's a whole bunch of like indirection that's happening here because this isn't actually the prototype itself. And the way that we're actually accessing the prototype is slightly different between these, and it causes kind of a cycle and a loop if we try to do it this way. Without using an instance. So I don't want to get too deep into that because frankly, it's not actually valuable to get into. The most interesting thing to see is that we actually are now at the object's prototype. So we can say in plain English that the prototype of an array is the object prototype. And then we know that the prototype of the object prototype is null because that's the end of the prototype chain. So if you were to think about this and draw it out, we could technically say array is inheriting from the prototype of object, right? If we were just, I'm just drawing it horizontally, but you can probably do it vertically if that makes more sense. And then this is pointing at null, which is the end of the prototype chain. Okay, so this is definitely pretty cool, right? So we can definitely say that in JavaScript, every array is technically also an object. Okay, and we will see in shortly that this is really, really, really very true in all essence of the word. So if you didn't get this part here with the __proto twice versus the array.prototype.proto, don't worry about it. Honestly, the actual details behind that are not important at all. The most important thing is to really understand this chain and that we can jump up these prototypes using an instance, or we can kind of do it this way using the actual prototype directly. And there's just some small nuances between them. All right, let's take a look at exercise 2. Okay, so what we want to do for this one, and this is kind of where I was hinting at previously in the first exercise as to how arrays are technically objects. Okay, so that's the hint for you for this one. We want to create a new object, okay, not an array, and we want to assign it to a variable called fake array. We want to give fake array this value, this object right here. Now take a look at this object. This is kind of strange, right? Like we have 0, which points to the word 0, 1, which points to the word 1, 2, which points to the word 2, and then we have a length of 3. So if you kind of look at this, and when you just even looking at this object, right? Like what is kind of weird about it? Like what seems oddly suspicious? That'll give you a hint for the rest of this. What we want to then do is we want to set the prototype of fake array to actually be the array prototype. Okay, so we're going to change the prototype. We saw that in the previous video, how we can do that. Then what we want to do is we want to see if we can use the map method, which only works on arrays, on fake array to log out each item in the array. So we want to do like fake array.map and then each item and log out the item. Okay, and I want to see if this works and why does it work if it does work. Okay, so give that a shot. Take a few of those hints that I gave you. Take your time with this one. It's definitely fun to actually try to trace what's happening, and then we'll take a look at it together. Okay, so I'm going to create const fake array here, and this is going to, I'm just going to copy this so we don't have to watch me do this. Spell const properly. Great. So what we then want to do is set the prototype of this fake array to be array.prototype, right? So let's just kind of look at what it is right now. So if I say console.log Object.getOwnPropertyNames of fake array, let's see what we get for this. Okay, I'm going to run node and exercise -2. So we have 0, 1, 2, and length. Okay. So that kind of makes sense, right? Because this is just an object. We have the 0, 1, 2, and length of 3. What about the prototype? So if we look at proto, right? This is an object. Keep that in mind, right? This is an object. I want you to think, what is the prototype of fake array going to be right now? Right? So if I run this, we're going to see this list, right? So there are ways to actually get the actual name of the prototype, which we'll see shortly actually in the bonus. But this is the object prototype, right? We've seen this before. Tostring, value of, toLocale string, etc. has own property. Those are all object prototype values. So we can say that fake array right now's prototype is the object prototype. Okay, so I'm just going to comment this out. I'm going to change this now. So I'm going to say fake array dot __ proto, and this is using the setter method on fake array to change the proto property to be something else. Well, what do I want to change it to? I want to change it to be array.prototype. Okay, I'm going to copy this line here. I'm going to paste it down here. I'm going to uncomment it. Now what I want to do is I'm actually going to get rid of proto real quick and just see what we get here. Okay, so it seems like nothing changed, right? if we log the property names after changing the prototype, it looks like nothing changed at all. We still have 0, 1, 2, and length. So that's kind of interesting. What happens if I put back proto, right? We changed the proto to array prototype, right? So we should probably get the things that are inside the array prototype for the property names for this object now. And we do, right? Look at that. It's no longer the object prototype. So we've permanently changed, right, fake array's prototype to be the array prototype. So this is interesting, right? So now what this allows us to do is now we've inherited these methods that we can use on our object, because now we're saying technically it has all the stuff available that an array has available, right? So the one that we're interested in is this one right here, map, right? So let's try this out. Let's see what we get. So I'm just going to comment this one out again. And I'm going to say fake array. So we've seen this in the map video, right, for arrays. But if I do .map, and I'm going to grab each item, and I'm going to console.log out the item. Okay. So this only works with arrays, right? If this was a regular object, we can't do .map on an object, right? We've seen that before. We saw that the map method doesn't exist on the object prototype. It's only on the array prototype. So the only reason that we can do this is because we changed the prototype of fake array to be the array prototype. So fingers crossed, let's see what happens. Is this going to break? Is this going to work? Let's see. Oh my goodness, right? It actually works. So we are logging out 0, 1, and 2. Now that's probably the most excited you'll see me get for logging out 0, 1, and 2. But this is quite remarkable, right? Map only works with arrays because we set up our object in a very specific way, right? Where the keys are basically the indices of the array. So we have 0, 1, 2, and then a length of 3. Technically, map only cares about that, right? It's just going to loop through the indices of this object. So we can technically say that arrays are very similar, or basically just glorified objects in JavaScript, where their keys happen to be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. Right? That is pretty cool. Really, really cool, right? We really want to hammer that home one more time because it is truly a very fundamental point of prototypes. Just because we set these key value pairs up in a certain way, where the keys are indices, arrays are index-based. So an array method needs to use the indices to loop through. It's going to go through 1, 2, 3, all the way up to the length minus 1. Since we set up our object this way and we set the prototype to be the array prototype, we can actually treat it like an array. This is what a lot of array-like objects do in JavaScript from third-party libraries, for example. But check this out. If I get rid of the fact that we're assigning to array prototype and then we try to do a map, let's take a look at what happens. We're going to get that map is not a function on the object, right? Which makes sense, right? Because it's not on the object prototype. We saw the property names on the object prototype and map is not in there. It's only on the array prototype. So this is only going to work if we actually allow the prototype of fake array to be reset to be array prototype, which itself has the object prototype above it. All right, pretty cool. Let's take a look at exercise 3. All right, so for this one, let's create a new object and we want to assign it to a variable called store. Then we want to give the store this value. So this is a bit nested here. So if you have this from the repo, you can just click it from the description and kind of copy and paste it from there, or just download it directly, or you can try to type it out. I tried to space this out so you can copy it without too much effort. But we have effectively 2 properties on this object. We have name, which is null, and we have stock, which is this array right here. Okay, stock is an array of objects where each object has its own name property and quantity property. So in this case, the first object has a name of candy and a quantity of 100. So of course we have the most candies in this stock because candies are the best, right? So once you have that copied out, what we want to do is we want to create another new object called myStore. And we want to assign it to an empty object. Okay. Then we want to change the name by doing mystore.name to myWonderfulStore, right? Which we can do because the name starts up as null. Okay. Actually, I kind of got ahead of myself there. The name doesn't start off as null. We actually want to assign the name. We want to assign a new name property onto myStore. So please ignore me there. I got too excited and I gave away a little bit of a hint. That's the next step after, right after this one. So we want to create an empty store, empty myStore, empty object, and we want to set its name property to be myWonderfulStore. So we'd say mystore.name is equal to myWonderfulStore. Okay. But then what we want to do is the interesting part. We want to actually set the prototype of our myStore to be this store object. Okay. So by default, it starts off as the regular object prototype, but what we want to do is we want to see if we can set the prototype to be store. Okay. So no longer object prototype, we want it to be store. Then we want to do the same thing, but with your store. So we want to create another object called your store and assign it to an empty object. Then we want to do yourStore.name and we want to set it to not myWonderfulStore. And then we want to do the same thing where we set the prototype of your store to be store, right? So we want to set the proto property of your store to literally equal to store. Now, what we want to do once we've done all this is we want to modify the quantity of fruit, right? Which is this object right here inside of myStore, which is this one right here, to be 300. Now this is kind of strange, right? Because if you think about this, the prototype of store of myStore is store, right? Because by default it only has a name. So we're going to try to change its prototype, which exists, and we're going to change its fruit to be 300. Then we want to log out the name and the stock from myStore, and then the name and the stock from your store. And we want to see if we can explain what's happening. And it definitely is a little bit tricky to figure out what exactly is happening. But once you start tracing the code, the purpose of this exercise is really to sit there and look at it and draw out what is really happening behind the scenes. Because if you can understand this, it really, really goes such a long way to helping you understand how prototypes work and just how memory in general works in JavaScript. So definitely the complex instructions there. I hope I explained it properly. Give that a shot and then we'll go through it together. Okay, so let's get started. So I'm going to say const store is equal to this object right here. So I'll just copy it. Then I want to create a new object called myStore and assign it to an empty object and then set its name to myWonderfulStore. So I'm going to say const myStore is equal to an empty object, and I'm going to say myStore.name, which doesn't exist to start, right? So this would be the same as assigning name as a property directly inside here. I'm just doing this kind of in 2 steps instead of 1 step. This is going to be myWonderfulStore. Okay, so we're going to same for your store. So I'm going to say const your store is equal to an empty object, and then your store.name is equal to not myWonderfulStore. Okay. So 2 different names, 2 different objects. This makes sense. But what I skipped over is setting the prototype of my store and your store to be the store object. So how do we do that? Let's do my store first. So I'm going to say my store. Well, what's the prototype of my store? It's going to be the object prototype, right? Because by default, when we create a new object like this, every object gets assigned the object prototype as its prototype, right? So we can access that prototype with either Object.getPrototypeOf or the easier method, which is __proto. But I want to reassign this, just like we did in exercise 2, where we changed the prototype to be the array prototype. I want to change the prototype of my store to be store instead. Okay, so I'm saying the prototype is now this, which is a little bit strange. Now this is slowly getting us into our next couple of topics as we're going to start to come up, which is the purpose of this, which is object-oriented programming. So definitely bear with me while we go through this. We're going to do the same thing for your store. We're going to do .__proto, and that's going to be store. So let's take a look at this before we even go any further. we have store, which is an object. It has name and stock. We have my store. If you just look at this code, it's not too bad, right? We have an object. We're assigning a name to that object. So we're going to have a mystore.name. This is a weird one where we're saying the prototype is equal to store. So we're reassigning the prototype to no longer be object.prototype, but it's literally going to be this object. Same thing for your store, but it has a different name. All right. So before we go any further, let's just take a look at this. I'm going to say console.log Object.getOwnPropertyNames of my store. Okay. Actually, I'll also do this once for store. So I'll do it once for store and one for my store. I'm going to run node exercise 3. So for store, we have name and stock. And then for my store, we have just name. So this makes sense, right? Like clearly the properties inside store are name and stock. And then the properties inside my store are just name. So that totally checks out. Right? This one is hidden by default because of some property descriptors, which we haven't got to yet. But it's basically a hidden property, but it does exist on there. It's just not going to show in this list. Okay, so let's take a look at the prototype. So let's start with the store prototype. So I'm going to say __proto. Okay. So if we look at this, we can see that this is the object prototype, right? We've seen this before in our previous exercises and the previous video, right? These are all things out of the object prototype. Okay, let's take a look at my store.__proto. Now I'm going to clear this console. I'm going to do this one more time. And what we'll see is, how curious, right? So the prototype of store is this object, which is the object prototype. But the prototype of my store is this, it's got these property names. Well, what has these property names? Well, it's store, right? We just saw that before. So that makes sense because we literally, that's what line 37 is doing. It's setting the prototype, right, of my store to be this object. And the property names on this object are name and stock. So in theory, if we do .__proto again, now we should end up with the same prototype that store has. So let's try that. And indeed we do, right? So hopefully you're starting to see this chain. All right, so I'm going to comment that out. What we want to do now is the steps 6 through 8. We want to modify the quantity of fruit in my store to be 300, log out name and stock from my store, log out name and stock from your store. Okay, so let's do that. So I'm going to say my store dot stock, and we want to grab fruit, right? So fruit is 0, 1, index 1 inside the array of stock, and then I'm going to say a dot quantity is equal to, what did I say I want to change it to? 300, right? So I'm saying go to my store, grab the stock property, right? Stock property does not exist on my store directly, but we're going to check the prototype next, which is what JavaScript does. It's going to check up the chain. Does it exist on the prototype? Well, what's the prototype? The prototype is store. So we check up on store. We check, oh yeah, we have a stock over here and it's an array. Let's go grab the second thing in there, which is fruit, and change the quantity to be 300. That's how that line of code actually works. Then we're going to console.log out my store.name and then my store.stock, which is the entire stock object. Okay, and we're going to do the same thing for your store. So I'm just going to do your store. Okay, so we're changing my store stock for fruit to be 300. Then we're logging out the stock for my store and your store, right? So we can see that the stock starts at 7 for fruit, right? So in theory, what we should see is my store's fruit stock should be 300 and your store's fruit stock hasn't changed yet because we didn't change it. It should remain at 7. So let's see what we get. I'm going to run this and, okay. Probably not what we expected, right? So for my wonderful store, right, the fruit is 300, which is fine. That's what we did on line 46. But for not my wonderful store, your store, right, the fruit is also 300. So what is happening here, right? What is going on? So I want you to think that arrays are just references, right? The prototype only exists one time. There is only one prototype per object type in JavaScript. So at any given moment, there is only one object prototype. There's only one array prototype, right? There's only one store prototype. So if we are messing around with that prototype, it's going to affect every other object that has that as its prototype. Okay, so it's like a global scoped prototype. So when we are changing the quantity of fruit in the prototype of my store, since your store's prototype is the same object, we are also changing it there. This is very similar to how we saw when we looked at arrays, that changing one reference changes the other reference. So this proves that there's only one prototype in this case. Okay, so this would be true for the array prototype or the object prototype in JavaScript as well. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. Now, the next exercise I have is the bonus, which is definitely a little bit tricky. If you feel comfortable with what you've seen so far, definitely check it out. We're going to kind of go full ham with that one. Otherwise, I encourage you to review this and then take a look at that because it's really going to be a good precursor to when we start looking at classes and object-oriented programming in JavaScript together. Okay, so here we go. I know it looks short, but it's a doozy. So for this one, I've introduced a new concept which I'm going to cover in the next set of videos, which is the this keyword. So for now, please just trust me and code this out. I normally don't like introducing things before actually explaining them, but this is really going to be not only a good precursor to the next videos on this exact keyword, no pun intended, but also for object-oriented programming, which we'll get to next, which I'll also explain in the next video. So we want to create this function right here. This is a function called person with a capital P. It has one parameter called name, and inside it's only going to do one thing. It's not going to return anything. It's not going to console log anything. It's only going to do this weird thing here where it's going to say this dot name is equal to name. Okay. So if you've seen this before, great. If you haven't seen it before and you're kind of just looking at this and being like, what on earth is happening? Totally fine, right? Just bear with me while we go through this example and we'll get into more examples of this and explanations to exactly what the this operator is doing in the next video. But what we want to do is make sure that this is a regular function. Don't use an arrow function for this. It will not work. Okay, and we'll get into that again in the next video, but it has to be a regular function in JavaScript, not an arrow function. All right, so once we have our person function, what we want to do is we want to create an instance of person in two ways. Okay, so again, there's a kind of a new keyword here, no pun intended, which we looked at briefly at the end of the last video, but we're going to look at much more when we get to classes as well as the next video. But we want to kind of do this. We want to create a person, Clio, like this, just calling our function and assigning it to Clio. Now, if you're particularly astute, you're already probably realizing kind of what Clio is going to be in this case. And then we're going to try this. We're going to say const Taylor is equal to a new person, and we're going to give the name as Taylor. But the only difference between these two is this keyword right here, which is new. All right. So what then we want to do is we want to log out the own property names for each of these variables, for Clio and then for Taylor. And we want to see if there's any issues with that, and then maybe try one or the other and see if we can get it working. Then we want to log out just Taylor's own property names and see if that works. Hint, hint, that one's not going to work. And then we want to log out the prototype of Clio and Taylor. Make sure that that works or doesn't work, figure out why, and then maybe also log out just the prototype of Taylor instead of Clio and Taylor. Okay, so I know this doesn't look particularly complex. The hard part here is not only the new keywords, but most importantly, what is actually happening behind the scenes for us with the small addition of these words. So give that a shot yourself, and then we'll go through it together. All right. So to start, I'm just going to copy this function right here. So here's my person function. Then we want to create an instance of our people in two ways. So I'll just copy this since I already have it here. So we're going to say const Cleo equals person. So I'm just going to call this function directly, and I'm going to pass it Cleo as a name. Then const Taylor is equal to a new person, and I'm going to give it Taylor this time as a name. And you can see my my editor is actually giving them slightly different names, which is a precursor to what we'll see next. So that's nothing too fancy, right? Apart from the new and the this, whatever's happening over there, we'll ignore that for now. This is just functions, and we're doing some weird stuff in here right now with whatever this is doing. This is so punny, right? No puns intended this whole time. And I keep saying this, whatever this is doing. I feel like the next video, I'm going to talk your ear off with all my funny puns. Let's see what happens when we actually log out the property names for both Cleo and for Taylor. So we're going to say console.log object.getOwnPropertyNames. And I'm going to see the property names for Cleo, not close, Cleo, and also for Taylor. All right, so let's see what happens here. So what we expect is, I don't really know what to expect, right? Like let's think about this. Maybe what should we expect, right? So if we assign to Cleo calling this function, well, we call this function, the function is not returning anything, so it should be returning undefined by default, right? So what's the property name of undefined? Well, we actually know that gives us an error because the undefined is not an object, so there's no property names on it, so we get an error with this function. So maybe that's going to give us an error. Well, then what about this thing? Is it going to do anything differently just because of this other keyword? I don't know, right? Let's figure it out. Let's try. So we're going to say node bonus exercise, and all right. So we get our error: cannot convert undefined or null to an object for getOwnPropertyNames for Cleo. Okay, so that's why I mentioned, we get the error. That's what happens right here. That's the answer to number 3. Let's try it with just Taylor's own property names instead of Cleo and Taylor, see what we get. So I'm going to clear my console. I'll try it for just Taylor, and okay. So that works. We get just name. So kind of curious. So what is happening? What is happening here, right? So getOwnPropertyNames really only works for objects, right? Or object-like things. So it seems like we're kind of somehow magically getting an object from this function when we use this new keyword. For some reason, it just returned to us magically, right? Seems to be what's happening. So we'll look in more detail in the next video when we actually look at what this is doing behind the scenes. But for now, maybe that's what's kind of happening. Right? Let's kind of see what happens here if we look at the prototype. So I'm going to say, actually, that's the next step. So let's do it for both. So if I try to grab the prototype of Cleo __ proto, we know this doesn't work, so I'm going to comment that one out. And I'm going to say __ proto here. Let's see what we get. So let's try this again. Okay, so we get another error. Cannot read property proto of undefined. So why is this happening? Okay, so this is for Cleo again here. We can see right on my case on line 30. So this is we're not happy. This kind of makes sense, right? If you think about it, we already know that the return value is undefined, right? So we're basically here, what are we trying to do? We're trying to do undefined dot __ proto, which makes no sense really, right? So of course it's going to yell at us that this is not going to work. Right? We're trying to grab the prototype of undefined, which is not going to work, right? There is no prototype for undefined because it's just undefined. So that's not going to work. So let's comment that one out. Let's look at just Taylor. See if we can get a prototype for just Taylor. Interesting. So what on earth is this? Right? That's the question. So let's have fun with this. Let's just keep going. Let's look at the prototype of this prototype. I keep going up the chain. And see what we get. Interesting. So we've seen this before, right? This is the object prototype. So interestingly, what seems to be happening is for some reason, when we use this thing, and we use this new thing, right? In kind of conjunction with each other, we are able to magically like hook up this prototype for us behind the scenes, and we get an object prototype, and then we also get this in-between thing, which is, who knows what that is, and I'll show you in a second what that is, with a constructor property. And then we have our regular object name here because we actually seem to get an object back from this new keyword. So this one kind of makes sense because we can see like, okay, so let's assume this new thing like makes an object. So maybe we're putting like a name property in that object, right? So let's see if that's true. So if that is true, then I should be able to log out Taylor.name, right? So if I do console.log Taylor.name, in theory, this should work and I should get Taylor. Let's see if that's true. Okay, I do. So this is legit, right? They're not lying to us. There's a name property on Taylor, so that's great. But okay, so line 34 though, that's this second constructor one. So what the heck is that, right? What is that? So I'm just gonna get rid of this object one because we've seen that a bunch before. I'm gonna try something cool. I'm gonna see what this constructor thing is. Like if it's an object, maybe it also has a prototype, right? But maybe it also just has its own keys. So let's actually just look at the second there. So I'm gonna say Taylor.proto is going to give us this, and then dot constructor. I want to see what are the keys inside this thing, right? Because it's a property on this prototype, right? I'm assuming it's an object. Hopefully it's an object and it's not like a string or something. But yeah, let's see what, technically I guess we get proper names for that too, but let's just see what we get here. Okay, so this constructor thing has a whole bunch of keys on it. Length, name, arguments, caller, prototype. That looks kind of weird. We haven't seen that before. I want to show you something really cool. I'm going to console.log, I'll do this upright below Taylor. I'm going to console.log out Taylor dot underscore proto dot constructor. And then we know that it has a name property, right? Dot name. Let's see what we get. And we get person. Interesting. So it seems to be what's happening is we are getting this like person object inserted in between us and the object prototype. So we could say that the prototype of Taylor is this person object, and the prototype of this person object is the object prototype. And this is all happening because this combination of new and this is actually giving us this functionality. So that is pretty cool, right? Now, if that all went way over your head, totally fine. That's why this was a bonus. We're going to go deeper into this concept when we actually look at this keyword specifically in the next video, but also we're going to go really deep when we look at object-oriented programming concepts in JavaScript with classes. So I hope you found this set of exercises valuable and interesting. Hopefully they weren't too challenging for you. If you did like them, I'd appreciate it if you could like the video and subscribe to the channel. I'd love to hear in the comments kind of what you thought of these exercises, and specifically, did you get any insights while you were actually going through them? Does this prototype chain idea make a little bit more sense to you as you're trying to hop through up and down this chain, looking at the different properties, assigning the prototype and changing it around? What did you think about the array prototype? Did that one make sense? I'd love to hear what you think in the comments, so definitely let me know. What we're going to do in the next video, as I mentioned already, is we're going to look at this keyword specifically. I'm going to create a video on that and a set of exercises because it's so important for us to understand how that works, because there's all of this kind of nuance around this keyword and mystery a lot of the time, and it can get a bit tricky if we aren't careful with how it works. And the combination of prototypes and that concept is going to set us up really, really nicely to start getting into object-oriented programming concepts in JavaScript together, as well as classes, which is going to wrap up this series once we go through a couple of sets of videos together on that concept, since it's going to take a little while to actually digest. So I can't wait to actually get to this keyword video. I hope you enjoyed these exercises. I'll see you in the next one. See you later.